I was reminded when I was getting ready for the children's moments of several years ago when I did children's moments on Labor Day Sunday also, and I asked the similar question here. What is something about Labor Day? And then I asked, well, what is labor? And one kid really popped right up and said, that's when a woman has a baby. And so I had to explain that labor has more than one meaning to them. So the fun part of working with children, they keep you on your toes and keep your thinking. Today we come looking at two scriptures. Paul's writings there to the church at Romans, that great epistle that he writes, where he begins talking about the supremacy of that we are saved by grace and grace alone, as Martin Luther would like to say. The book that he was reading and studying when he discovered and developed all of his great theses on grace. But yet when we get to chapter 12 in Romans, Paul takes a little bit of a different turn. While the first 11 chapters he talked about God's grace for us, then he reminds us of how we are to live. That if we are to be a people of grace, then it is to make a difference in the lives that we lead, in the lives that we live, and certainly in the way that we treat others. And so Paul starts giving some very practical advice to the Christians there in chapter 12. It was said of St. Francis of Assisi, that great teacher who taught us much, who gave us the nativity to teach the story of Christ's birth, who blesses the animals, who teach us to live with works of charity, used to say, let all of the friars should preach by their deeds. Trying to say it is how we live our lives that really make a difference. And then, of course, Jesus' teaching here in Mark. They are going through gleaning his disciples from the edges of the field. From the Old Testament, we know that if you had a field of grain, you were to leave the outer edge for the poor and the needy to come and glean and gather what they needed. It was a part of who you were. It was not something that you were to do because you wanted to be seen well, but it was really a part of your religious instruction. The book of Ruth gives us a wonderful story of Ruth out gleaning in the field of Boaz. But there they are coming and they are traveling, and so they have no provisions to eat. And so they go and begin to glean the grain that is there and begin to eat, except the Pharisees see them and they see them eating without the ceremonial washing of their hands. Of course, they would have no water or no special place to do this ceremonial cleansing with them, which was an important part of their Jewish faith. It was a tradition that really holds fast, and we love to, when we come to Maundy Thursdays, think of Jesus sitting and washing his disciples' feet as a part of their gathering for the Passover, as a part of that ritualness of it. And we know that rituals are good because they do give us things to hold on to when things seem to fall apart. But here Jesus, as they say to him, why do your disciples do this? Why do they break from the traditions of the past to do something? And Jesus reminds them that it is really a moving on. It is not the sense that all traditions are bound to us by law. Yes, they saw it as their moral obligation, but Jesus tries to talk to the Pharisees and say, really, do you not understand? It is what comes out of you. It is how you act and how you share the love of God that is more important than just the ritual keeping of your traditions or your laws. And maybe he could say that to us, that how we live our lives is really more important than how we go about keeping the other traditions that we face. Yes, we get into the habit of our own traditions, of doing things the way that we have always done because they bring us hope, they bring us comfort. But sometimes we need to understand that it is really that sense of what lies beyond. Of course, we love this communion table that is before us. We love to come and receive the cup and the bread each week as we partake. We know that it is important to us. It is so important to us that once a month our elders and deacons take this communion and go and visit the shut-ins. And many other times during the month, members of our caregivers and others take to shut-ins and share, because it is in that sharing of the loaf and cup that it is a very important part of who we are, that we are reminded of God's saving grace for us and God's love. And it reminds us that we are bound to one another. But I remembered when I was in Kearney, Nebraska, I once had a member who had been gone for a few Sundays on some vacation and visiting. He was retired. And when he came back, Earl came up to me and said, "Pastor, we went to visit a disciples' church and they took communion in a totally different way than we take communion." And I thought, well, maybe they came. Well, we do intention every now and then. We come forward on special days, World Communion, Christmas Eve, maybe a few other times. And I said, well, how did they take communion, Earl? And he said, when they passed the trays, they took the bread and they held it, and they took the cup and they held it, and then they all took it together. And I said, well, Earl, that's the way a lot of disciple churches do that, and that's the way I'd done it for the other churches I'd served before coming here. But he said, but we take it and we put the cup back in the tray. And I said, Earl, there is a practical reason for that. If you look on the back of our pews, we have nowhere to place the communion cups. They did not have those little holders that you have on yours. And yet what had grown out of a sense of necessity there in that church, he had thought would be the norm for everyone. And so we had a nice discussion that not everything is always done in the same way, and what is normative for one is not always normative for the other. But at least we forget what is the real importance of communion by forgetting just what is a part of that. But greater than that is here with Christ's disciples, what they were forgetting, these Pharisees, that what was really important here was that the people would come by and would find food to eat. And those that needed something to eat would have it made available to them. Not so much whether they carried forth the ritual cleansing that was a part of this. So Jesus begins to condemn them and said it is by their other actions of how they act that is very important. And Paul there, when he writes to Romans, notice what he says to them. Not only how to treat one another within the congregation that they are a part of, but how to treat their enemies. To pray for their enemies, to love their enemies, to feed their enemies, to clothe their enemies. Doesn't sound like that's the way that most of the time we think about our enemies. Oh, let us punish them and hope that they can see the right way. I read a few days ago, someone had posted on Facebook, the best evangelism is just to tell people you are a Christian. And then hopefully they will watch your life. And good evangelism should mean that our lives really share more than what we say. Just as St. Francis said, the friars should go everywhere preaching by what they do. It is not just for the friars, it is for us. To live with that sense of love, with that sense of grace, with that sense of hope, that even we can look beyond our enemies. In 1999, Kathy and I took our 25th anniversary trip and went to Europe. We got to go visit Holland, which was see some of her family. But a part of that trip, we went to the Anne Frank house there in Amsterdam. And you go up these stairs into this little room, small place above then what was a spice shop when she lived there. And you begin to see here is a small place where two families would live, where the children could not go out and play. And when customers were downstairs, had to be quiet. And yet you wonder, was this a place to raise a child? We like to think of better places and better activities to raise children, to allow them out to play in the fresh air, to have the sense of childhood. And yet she records in one of her famous deals that basically this young girl still says that basically people are still good in their heart. One that would die at the hands of the Nazis, one that would go to the concentration camp. We wonder how a child could have such wisdom that basically she still believed people were good even through the ordeal that she must suffer. Yes, that is a call for us to look at our lives, to look back and see how do we face those others round about us. How do we really look and see, and how do our deeds proclaim the good news of Christ? For if we are saved to good works. We are saved to help others. We are saved to be an example, not just in words, but also in deed. Yes, it means that we have to find a deep trust, a trust and a love for others, that we can allow them to have the way that they go. Here, as the Pharisees see Jesus' disciples, they want to cause issues. They cannot trust that they just need something to eat and are eating and would go on doing the work of God. But it is that sense that we need to develop this trust, as Paul would talk about, so that we could even look and see others and have a sense of care and compassion even on our enemies. But that most of all, we could treat each other with that. What are we known by as a church? What are we known by? Sometimes it is a question for us. In Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, there's a story about a stingy old woman who has gone to the misery of Hades and a lake of fire. There where she had found herself, and she wants to be raised to the comforts of heaven as would all. And then one day an angel comes by and she yells to the angel, I wasn't all that bad. And the angel turns around and comes back. And she says, what about the time I helped that poor beggar who came by and I gave him an onion? As the angel swoops down over the old woman, they look back upon that scene. The old woman had resentfully come to the door. There she looked out and tried to shoo the beggar away because he was filthy and his hands and his face were dirty. And she had said to him, don't you even wash before you come to beg? But nonetheless, she had reached into her cupboard and there had found an onion that was beginning to rot and given it to the poor beggar. Well, said the angel, that should be enough to open the doors of heaven for you. And with that, the angel lords a rope with that very onion tied upon the end. The woman grabs a hold of the onion, and as the rope is being lifted up from the lake of fire, others began jumping on and holding on to her, hoping to be pulled out as well. And finally, the old woman cries out in alarm, let go, let go. It is not you who are being pulled out. It is me. It is not your onion. It is mine. And with that, the onion breaks and they all fall back into the lake of fire. The angel weeps as she flies away and says, surely the onion would have been strong enough to have pulled all of them out together if they had only seen that they were all in this together and not looking to their own selfish needs. Yes, that is a call for us to action. Yes, here Jesus looks to the Pharisees with all of their earnestness and all of their codes. And there he reminds them, though, that what is greater than trying to keep their traditions, and even calls them for some traditions they use to get around the law, that what is really important is the sermon that they preach themselves with their actions. St. Augustine of Hippo used to say, love God and do as you please, but then he also writes to say, if you truly love God, you will also do what pleases God. It is that sense that we are changed by grace, and when we are changed by grace, we learn to live and to be a different people. For it is the grace that changes us, is also the grace that changes world. Remember, life is short. We do not have too much time to gladden the hearts of those who travel the way with us. Yes, the very simple way is for us to love, to make haste to be kind, and the blessings will be received from God in one fell swoop, and our relationship with others will show a difference. Yes, it is that simple. We need to love God and to love others. Though it is easy to say, the difficulty in that comes when we try to live it out for our own selfishness, our own greed, our own sense of what it means to have hope gets in the way. Today we come to be reminded of what it means for God, who loved us and gave himself for us, that we can walk in a newness of life. Let us examine ourselves and see what hinders us, and let us remove all that hinders us, so that we too can walk in God's grace, in God's love. May you be the sermon that everyone sees, that everyone knows you are a Christian. Share God's love with word and deed with all whom you meet. Amen.